playing Christmas music and my favorite Christmas songs because I think, Robert Rosen, I am the Jew who loves Christmas. How are you this morning, my friend?
I'm doing more or less okay. I got a bit of a cold, but, nothing terminal here.
Oh, so. We could have done it another day. I don't want to.
No. I just, I got to go to work tomorrow, and, it's just my schedule's been crazy lately.
Yeah, you've been where in the world is Robert Rosen? Welcome back on, my friend.
We got back from Spain about 2 weeks ago. I was there doing a Nowhere Man thing. Wow. A new Spanish edition came out, as you might know, and they invited me to Madrid to do a presentation. So we went to Madrid, and, that was great.
Robert Rosen, Nowhere Man, The Final Days of John Lennon, and other books. But let me ask you, what was Madrid like? What was that like for you?
We'd never been to Madrid before. We'd been to Spain, to Mallorca. But, Madrid is a big city, and we stayed in an Airbnb there in a neighborhood called Malasaña. And, it's like Greenwich Village. And, the people there, they're just such huge Beatle fans, stayed in and fans of the book. And the reception I got there is pretty much unlike anything that's ever happened before. These people, wow. Time stopped for them when the Beatles stopped, which is about 1970. And I've just never met people who were more into the Beatles than these Spanish Beatle fans. Really?
That's wild. Because, again, the Beatles, internationally renowned. What can you say about the Beatles? How do you can't overstate the popularity of the Beatles, correct? But you're saying, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's still an ongoing thing. Paul is still performing. Ringo is still performing. Ringo had been in Spain recently, and this thing was organized by a Spanish Beatles magazine. And, these people have met Paul, they've met Ringo, and they just, they can't get enough Beatles. And I was, happy to answer all their questions.
Wow. So for you, if you don't mind, I always ask you to do this, Robert Rosen, but take us back to the early days of the development of Nowhere Man. Pre-Nowhere Man. What was going on with you?
Pre-Nowhere Man?
Yeah.
I don't remember anymore. It was so long ago.
I remember the story. I remember. You got to remember.
Pre-Nowhere Man. Let's go back to the summer.
Let me stop you a second. It's so good to see you. It's been so long since we've talked. I love playing. I love playing your wife's music. I love playing Marilyn May Scott's music. I always love. People get upset if I play Christmas music before Thanksgiving, and I get that. I get that, but it's great after because I can play Blue Lights from now through, till the tree comes down, which will be sometime probably in February. But go ahead.
Oh, pre-Nowhere Man, going back to the summer of 1980, I had moved to Los Angeles, where I was trying to break into TV comedy writing. I had gotten a tryout on the Friday show, which is where Larry David got his start. And that didn't work out. And I came back to New York. It was November. Lennon's album had just come out, Double Fantasy. And this all has to do with my friend Fred Seaman, who'd been working for Lennon since February 1979. And from his first day on the job, he said, we have to collaborate on a book about Lennon. And his family went back with Yoko Ono to the early 1960s. His uncle, Norman Seaman, had produced Yoko Ono's performance art pieces in Carnegie Hall. His aunt, Helen Seaman, was Sean's governess, and Fred was his assistant. And for 2 years, from 1979 through 1980, when Lennon was killed, Fred had just been keeping me up to date on what was going on in the Dakota. I had been taking notes. And then after Lennon was killed, he said, we have to move forward on the project. And we did. And the thing that happened, Memorial Day weekend, 1981, Lennon was killed December 8th, 1980. It's about 5-6 months later then. He brought me Lennon's diary. And he said that, this is the key to the project. And, I transcribed Lennon's diaries, and I went on vacation. Fred told me I'd been working hard. I should go on vacation. I took a vacation in Jamaica. When I got back, this was like February 1982 now, March 1982. When I got back, my apartment had been ransacked. Everything I had been working on Lennon had been taken. Fred did it. And I was in a state of shock. And then when Nowhere Man really began, the book that became Nowhere Man, was that I realized after getting over my shock that I had large portions of Lennon's diaries memorized. And I started writing it down. The more I wrote down, the more I remembered. And it took 18 years to find a publisher. And over those 18 years, I was refining the book. And, then it was published, and you know what happened after that. The book
I sure do.
Exploded in many different languages.
And that's how we met.
Yeah.
When it was Soft Skull Publishing?
Yes. Soft Skull Press.
I can't believe I remembered that. Wow. Good way to go, Mr. Memory, this morning. I usually can't remember things, from like an hour ago. That was, wow. Yeah, that was the original, correct? The original.
Right, and I think I was on your show for the first time before it even came out. You probably had a review copy, and you wanted to talk about it, and I was happy to come on and talk about it.
And we talked for hours. I remember that. We had a blast.
Yeah, we had a marathon.
And that was the original disclaimer. My adult disclaimer was an outgrowth of that first interview. When I was new in radio, Bob, I was new in radio, and I asked you to read from it at the end, and you alerted me to the verbiage in that, and I thought, yeah, it's part of the book. It's got to be okay. And then shortly after that, got a letter from the FCC because somebody complained that there was vulgarity on broadcast radio, and I remember writing back saying I felt it was part of the artistic content of the show. I never heard from him again.
Right, and that was actually a couple of years later, after I'd been on the show a couple of times.
Was it? Okay.
Probably a couple of times.
Wow, that was I remember that. I remember that in the early days, and hence the disclaimer: the Louie B. Free Radio Show, Brainfood from the Heartland, is an adult-oriented show intended for and only for mature adult audience. Listener discretion is strongly advised. If you can't hang, drop off. But I'm talking with Robert Rosen. So when it came out again, the publicity for you being now the guy that had John Lennon's diaries and that look into Lennon's life, what was that like for you?
When all the publicity started, it took me by surprise. I mean, I thought the book was going to do okay, but at this point, we're talking about publicity that I can't say it's been nonstop for 18 years, but it's been an ongoing thing for 18 years. And, each time Lennon's birthday comes around and the anniversary of his murder comes around, the publicity starts up again. And lately, the past, quite a few years now, that more has been happening in Spanish language than in English language. And, there were a couple of things in the Spanish language press last week about the diaries. And there was a thing on TV on this show called Hollywood Scandals. I was on TV this morning. I'm on the radio now. So, I mean, it's just, at first it was shocking that it was just going on like that. And, I've kind of acclimated myself to it over 18 years. And, I've written a book that has endured. And, I couldn't be more delighted.
So for you, again, going to Spain all these years later after the book, you were telling about how excited they were. I mean, you've been in Latin America. I mean, there are how many editions now? Are you able to keep track of how many?
I think there, something like 14 maybe in different languages, different formats. Yeah, I think about 14.
Wow, So about 14 different, which was inconceivable back when you first wrote the book, correct?
Yeah, of course. Yes, absolutely.
Your hopes and dreams at that time were what? That the book would get out and what?
I thought, the book would do okay, and I'd have the opportunity to write another book.
That was that. Go ahead, and you did.
That was pretty much it. I mean, the best thing that happened is the book did so well, I was able to drop out of the workforce for 14 years from September 1999 when I finally went back to work in September 2013.
Because of the popularity of Nowhere Man, The Final Days of John Lennon, which still sells, which is still available and still sells all those years later. That's not always the case, correct, with books? You know better than I. No,
like the old cliche is books have the shelf life of yogurt. And, 18 years is a long time. I think I can declare the book a cult classic at this point.
So what for you going to Spain, you were telling us earlier about what it was like and the intensity of the fandom, if you will, for the Beatles, different than the United States, different than England, different?
Yeah.
Oh, tell it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the people there, they're just somehow less cynical than the people here. They just like this pure, unadulterated love, unconditional love of the Beatles. And it's really unlike anything I've seen here in decades. It's like, I mean, yes, Paul and Ringo are still there, still performing. Both of them have gone to Spain to perform. But, it's like the Beatles never ended.
Did you?
And these people just, they still, after all these years, all these decades, they still just live and die with the Beatles, and they just want to know everything about them.
So when you went, did you have any idea of quite how ecstatic they would be when you arrived? I mean, obviously you knew they wanted to bring you in. They obviously wanted to bring you to Spain, so you knew they were pretty excited about it. But when you got there, what was it like? How was it different than what you thought it would be?
Well, when we got there, there's all these people in Spain who I'd been in touch with over the internet going back to like 2003 maybe, and I met these people finally for the first time, and it was just the night. The event took place at this place called Cafe Comercial in like downtown Madrid, and it's a big old cafe that has a literary reputation. People came from like all over the country. That surprised me. People traveled like from the far points of Spain to come to Madrid to see this thing, and the energy was just electric. The questions were very good. A lot of them wanted to know about this woman, Rosa. I can't think of her last name now, but she was Spanish, and she was Lennon's housekeeper. And they had a lot of questions about her. She'd written a book. I really couldn't answer those questions because Lennon had never mentioned this housekeeper in his diaries. That the only time he spoke about employees in his diaries was when they pissed him off. And, Rosa apparently never pissed him off. Fred never mentioned her. But, they had a lot of questions about that. I answered them as best I could, even though I never heard of her. But, they just wanted to know in detail, beyond what I wrote about in Nowhere Man, what was going on in Lennon's life. And, I mean, the people, were just so friendly and open and excited and so happy to meet me that it was just, really a wonderful experience. And then after the event, most of the people who came to the thing went to a restaurant a couple of blocks away called Strawberry Fields, and they had like videos of the Beatles playing there, and we just, hung out in the restaurant and talked, and it was just a really fun night.
Wow. So what wonderful, again, this many years after that. After Nowhere Man, again, in fact, let me go back to that horrible day in November, if you
December.
would. December, I'm sorry, with John Lennon. Tell us what that was like for you.
Well, I had gotten back from Los Angeles a couple of weeks earlier. I was looking for a job. Lennon's album had just come out. It was getting a lot of press all over the place. The night that it happened, it was a Monday night. I was just hanging out at my apartment. When Fred comped weed for Lennon, he would always break off a little piece and give it to me. So I was hanging out at my apartment, smoking Lennon's weed, listening to the radio. It was December 8th, the day that Lennon was murdered, is also Jim Morrison's birthday. So they had a Doors special on the radio. And I was listening to that and smoking Lennon's weed. And then, news came over the radio that John Lennon had been shot. And, obviously this was extremely shocking news. My first thought was, oh, this couldn't be serious. He's probably just, a flesh wound or something. And, then soon after that, they said, John Lennon is dead. And I think I knew at that moment that my life was going to change. And I tried calling Fred at the Dakota. I couldn't get through. I ended up speaking to one of the people who worked in the front office there. And, I just said something like, I'm so sorry. I don't have any words. And, I decided that I was going to go down to the Dakota and see what was going on there. So I got on the subway and I went down to the Dakota, and, it was all these people in front of the Dakota. They were playing Lennon music on their boom boxes. They were holding up, headlines from the paper, John Lennon shot dead. I just, hung out there for a while and I took the scene in, and I ran into somebody who I knew from cab driving, a fellow cab driver from somewhere in Europe, Peter Moloko, I think his name was. And, we hung out together, and I went home, and a couple of days later, Fred came to my apartment and said, now is the time to, move forward on the project.
So for you, again, that all these years later, when I think about, and I'm not going to compare the two, and you and I've talked about this, I had never bought a Beatles album, and I wasn't a Beatles fan that a lot of others were. But when you think about John Lennon, I'm not going to compare this. I don't want this to be insulting to you, Robert Rosen, but when I think about how many young people remember Brian Jones from the Stones, probably young people, probably not a lot. Probably right now there's a lot of people thinking, who's he talking about? They may know, they know Keith and they know Mick, but the Lennon, I don't want to say it's, Lennon lives on differently than a lot of other musicians that have died or been murdered or whatever, differently because of the Beatles, differently. Try to explain that to me, Bob.
I don't think it's really that hard to explain that. He was the leader of the Beatles. In his life, he was so controversial and so outrageous. And, when the Beatles were an ongoing thing, he was probably the most famous person in the world. And, then he died in this horrible. Yeah, he was essentially martyred, and at the way he died, for the same reason that people will never stop talking about John Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy or really anybody who was assassinated, and the fact that he was killed after the 5-year seclusion, and then the new album came out, and as far as bringing attention to the murder, the fact that the album Double Fantasy was already in the news and a hit, though not a huge hit, was the whole situation was just so shocking and dramatic and unforgettable.
Some people are asking, what are your thoughts on Yoko Ono? And we've talked about Yoko. We've talked about Yoko a lot over the years, Bob Rosen. Go ahead.
I have met Yoko Ono a number of times. She's not my enemy. She's not my friend. When she needs something from me, which hasn't happened in like 10 years, maybe more now. Her lawyers will contact my lawyers. She's a very good businesswoman. And I don't like some of the things she did to me, like holding my diaries for 18 years after she asked if she could see them. But I came to her with an open mind and an open heart. And the mistake that I made was, believing what John sang about. We hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. And I can't say I like her. I just, try to maintain an air of neutrality about her. She does what she's going to do, and that's fine.
When you again, some of the legal things over the years have been difficult, like you said about the diaries, possession of diaries, etc. But if she does her thing, you do your thing, correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That at this point, and it's been a long time, she doesn't bother me, and I don't bother her. I do not trash her in the media like a lot of people do. I just, when people ask me about Yoko, I just, try to answer the question as honestly and as objectively as possible.
Do a lot. You get that a lot, though, correct? About what your thoughts are. Yeah, like I'm getting now to ask you. Correct?
Yeah, I do get it quite a bit. And, like I said, I answer the question pretty much the way I just answered it.
When, again, RobertRosenNYC.com, RobertRosenNYC.com, when I look at your website and I see the different versions of the book and that one that came out, that Spanish edition, I mean, that's got to be wild. I know I've asked you this like 3 times already this morning, maybe more. But that's got to be wild for you. Again, all these years later, and if it was initially, but all these years later, and again, as you say, John Lennon was martyred. I know, and I'm not sure. I'm getting some messages about. Well, let me ask you this: do you think his murder will? I don't think his murder. They're ever going to release him. Do you?
I don't think he'll ever get out. No.
After such a. Another question is popping up. Do you know whatever happened to the album that he signed for his murder?
I think it was sold at auction to a collector.
Wow.
A couple of years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, not 100% sure of that, but I have a vague recollection of that's what happened.
For younger listeners, do you mind recounting what happened that day when he was murdered?
The day that he was
when he was murdered, yeah. You told it from your perspective, but can you tell what happened?
Yeah, that Mark David Chapman came from Hawaii to New York with the intent of murdering John Lennon. He was a mentally unstable person that, according to Fred Seaman, the afternoon of the murder, the afternoon of December 8th, when Lennon came out of the Dakota, Mark Chapman was waiting in front with the album. He also had the gun. He got Lennon's autograph on the album, and according to Fred, he asked John if he would hire him to work in the Dakota, because, Chapman had read in like the Playboy interview that sometimes, Lennon and Yoko hired fans off the street. And he asked him for a job, and John told him to send his resume in. And, Chapman was obsessed with The Catcher in the Rye, the book by J.D. Salinger, which is narrated by Holden Caulfield. And, one of the ongoing themes of The Catcher in the Rye is Holden Caulfield hates phonies. And Chapman was so crazy that he believed that if he murdered Lennon, he would literally disappear into The Catcher in the Rye and become Chapter 27, and he would be the new Catcher in the Rye. The book ends on Chapter 26. He thought that by shooting Lennon, he would write Chapter 27 in Lennon's blood. And, he felt that Lennon was just a huge hypocrite because, he sang about imagine no possessions, and, he just lived in this incredible luxury. He lived the opposite of what he sang about and preached. And Holden Caulfield, who Chapman identified with totally, was against hypocrisy and hypocrites. And, that is why he murdered Lennon, because, he thought that he would become part of the book.
Wow. Let me another quick question, if you've got another couple minutes. What about why did Yoko keep the diaries? What was the process in trying to get them back? What can you say?
Why did she keep the diaries? I don't know. Probably to punish me or something like that. Even though I came forward to help her and I put myself at risk because I really didn't know what was going to happen when I came forward. Yoko is very into, punishment and vengeance. And, that was her punishment for me. And she kept the diaries for 18 years. But by doing that, she forced me to creatively go to a place where I would not have gone to had I had my diaries. And, I think because of the way the whole thing played out, that Nowhere Man became a better book, a more creative book that, had I had all the information, my diaries, John's diaries, I would not have attempted to write the book from the perspective of being inside Lennon's head. And, what Nowhere Man does that other John Lennon bios don't do is that it shows you the world through Lennon's eyes. And, that's part of the reason that the book has endured for so long.
Bob Rosen, on your website, tell us a little bit about the website, if you will.
My website, I got all the information about Nowhere Man, about Beaver Street, which was my other book. I don't know if you know yet, but I've got a new book coming out in 2019. You read an early draft of it.
Is that yeah. Oh, God. Bobby in Naziland. That's right. I remember reading it. Oh, my God. Go ahead. Tell it.
Yeah, this is the cover. It's being published by Head Press in London, who published my previous book, Beaver Street. And I had submitted the book as a novel, and they wanted to publish it as nonfiction. So Bobby in Naziland is a memoir about growing up in Brooklyn in the 1950s and 1960s. It's a child surrounded by Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans who fought the Nazis. And, it's darkly funny. You could read a synopsis on my website.
RobertRosenNYC.com, right?
Robert Rosen, NYC.com. Yes.
Oh, quick question, if you don't mind. Can you shed any light on Yoko's battle with Julian and why Julian was not in John's will?
That battle's over. Julian, got a very nice inheritance. This happened years ago. He's set for life now. And, they were at war for a long time. Julian did not like her. I don't know what Yoko thought of Julian. There's a lot of stuff in John's diaries about Julian. They were not close. But, Julian won the battle. He got, millions of dollars and a lot of his father's memorabilia. And, Julian is doing fine. And I'm glad you're doing fine, and your wonderful wife and your very talented wife also, Mary Lynn May Scott. Bob, I love you guys. We got to get you back, maybe even sooner than when the new book comes out. We can talk maybe after the 8th or something, and get you back soon because I miss talking with you guys, and I'm delighted to have you, honored to have you. Robert Rosen, NYC.com. I'm so glad to connect with you again, my friend. And Mary Lynn just said to tell you she's doing a show December 12th? Yeah, December 12th at the Sidewalk Cafe in New York City. If anybody from New York is listening, please come to the show. Wish I could be there with you guys. Bob, thank you. I'll be great. Give her a hug for us. Thanks, man. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Louie. Robert Rosen.